The second condition that you need to be able to explain and discuss treatments for is depression. Depression is a word which is used quite commonly throughout language today, but when we use it, we need to make sure we are referring to clinical depression, which is characterised by persistently low mood and a lack of enjoyment or pleasure. So this isn't something which is fleeting, this is something which carries on over a sustained amount of time. Now, we're using the cognitive approach to explain depression, and that involves thinking processes. If you need a refresher on the cognitive approach, then please go back to the screencast under the approaches and have a look, as we will be using those principles throughout this. So, cognitive underpinnings then. So, depression is explained using the cognitive approach by the idea of maladaptive thinking. Now, maladaptive thinking is anything which isn't useful or isn't helpful for us. So thinking processes which are harmful for us in some ways. And there are lots of different examples of maladaptive thinking, including negative thought processes, faulty information processing, negative schemas, and irrational beliefs. Now, if we have a look at some more specific examples of these, here we've got some possible thought processes that somebody with depression may have. So for example, we've got an idea of masturbatory thinking there. We must always succeed in something, thinking that something has to happen in order for us to be successful. We've got an example of I can't standarditis. If something isn't perfect, it must be a major disaster. Or exaggeration, so when we blow negative events out of proportion, we think the consequences are going to be far worse than they actually are. Or utopianism, thinking that life must always be fair. And lastly, minimization, which is when an individual minimizes the importance of positive things. Now, it's quite important when we think about the cognitive approach to understand what these key terms mean, and understand that very often key terms will mean similar things to each other or even the same things, and can even possibly be used in place of one another. So when we think about maladaptive thinking, people with depression tend to show these maladaptive thought processes, and they might show some or all of any of these different examples that we've got here, or any others. So there were two models specifically that explained in detail how this sort of maladaptive thinking can cause depression. And the first one is Ellis's ABC model. Now, ABC stands for, first of all, action. So this is the beginning of the process where a particular event occurs, and I've used the example here that maybe somebody is made redundant. Now, as a result of that particular action, people have beliefs, which is what the B stands for. Now, at this point, it's important to remember that according to the cognitive approach, we would all analyse this event anyway. We have thinking processes which we then respond to. And it's at this point that those thinking processes could lead you down the path of depression if they are maladaptive. So somebody who is maybe quite healthy in their thought processes might respond to something like redundancy by thinking, this is a really good opportunity for me, I can move my career into something I really love doing, and they'll see it as something very, very positive. Somebody with maladaptive thinking might think, well, I must just be really bad at my job then. So they've picked up on that negative aspect of the situation. Now, as a result of those beliefs, consequences occur, and this is what the C stands for. So if you have a very healthy thought pattern and you're thinking about this redundancy as an opportunity to move on, then you might be motivated, you'd be happy, you'd be ready for a new start. If you've got these maladaptive thought processes, then that thinking processes is more likely to lead to depression. And it's through this mechanism that Ellis thought that depression would occur. The second model you need to know about is Beck's negative triad. And Beck believed that people with depression have a tendency towards faulty information processing and the development of negative self-schemas. And he came up with 3 negative thought processes called the negative triad, which he thought that people with depression tended to display. And they included negative views about the world, negative views about the self, and negative views about the future. So if you're feeling negative about all of those 3 things, then that is what would lead you to feel depressed. So you can have a look at the two models for explaining depression in the pre-reading. And before you come into the lesson, make sure you can use that different terminology to explain the basic cognitive underpinnings of the cognitive explanation for depression. So remember, all of that language we talked about at the beginning, the maladaptive thinking, is present in both of those models, and it's important that you can use that terminology when you're explaining those models. The second thing you should be able to do is to describe the 3 steps to depression in Ellis's ABC model. And lastly, explain how the negative triad can cause depression according to Beck.